Welcome back once again, and in this part we're going to explore rendering and how the actual final scene is going to look. It's one of my favorite parts to do. So first off, let's have a think about what we're gonna do here and some strategies. So we're going to render the space scene, but then the FUI I'm going to render separately and composite in post. And we'll work out how we're going to do that and what kind of decisions we'll need to make that practical and possible. So firstly, let's organize our scene a bit more so that I can isolate the FUI only, and then the rest of it can be hidden or shown as well. So let's create a new layer and call this one FUI, of course. Give it a less horrendous color, maybe like a chalky green. And let's start adding these. So this, and this, they're all part of our FUI. And then in the robotic arm, we've got the screen geometry, definitely. These 2 points they're not rendered, but they're in part of the FUI, and that obviously the screen edges as well. So now I've got them. If I hold Control whilst I drag these onto this layer in the layer browser, it'll add everything, including the children and all their tags. So if I go here and find something with a tag, oh, typical, of course, none of that has tags, you can see they get added to the layer as well, which means that when I lock it, all of it gets locked and I can't edit it. And it also means that if I want it all to be turned off, and even if I turn all these off as well, it won't even generate anything. So our scene will be back to its nice and speedy mode, but we will have cleaned up that scene. So actually, this is a good place to actually take a look at our scene, because we haven't really rendered this or looked at this, and all the materials have been set up for the base scene, but we obviously need to go and create some for our FUI, and that's the important part. So let's take a look at the scene as is. I tell you what, I might turn the goo back on actually. So I might put the goo on a separate layer, because that's a separate visual element that'll actually have relevance in the scene. Let's choose another chalky orange color. Let's jump in here. I don't want to put the whole hierarchy in. I'm going to just take these 2 meshes, and I'm just going to add them. There we go. So now when I turn off everything else, these 2 guys are still surviving. And by the way, if I minimize this goo layer after unlocking it, and then I lock it and hide it, our goo is missing. So you'll want to make sure that before you lock the layer, this is expanded. So lock and then hide the layer. You don't have to hide the layer. In fact, yeah, let's not hide the layer. Then we can see where stuff is and we can still access things. Okay, so we got these. Let's open VDB Mesh. Let's just scrub, make sure everything's in the scene. Excellent. Now, what material are we going to assign the weird looking goo stuff here? Well, I think clearly it has to be the same material as our agar. Now that's hidden at the moment. Let's just show it. Only hidden in the viewport. It would still render. And then let's assign the same material to our OpenVDB mesher, or our cache of that. And let's go to my cycles layout. I just like to check my devices and what I'm using. I'm using CUDA, and I'm using 2 of my 3 GPUs. One is my monitor, so I want to leave that open. So I'm just going to press play, let it load the scene in, and we'll get a kind of a gist of what the lighting's doing and all that kind of stuff. Now I have the rendering. I have the goo. All this stuff is actually sat under a hierarchy that has the rendering option turned off, so I have to turn that back on to be able to see that again. So that's fine. Turn that back on, and you can see we've got this nice / disgusting gooey stuff at the bottom here. Let's just jump into a few different frames. So start with frame 0. And you can see we've got a bit of I think we've got some depth of field on. If not, we will add some, because I quite like having depth of field in these things. And you can see we've got this red light at the back here. That's actually a flashing emergency light. If we take a quick look at how that's set up, actually, just out of just pure interest, let's unlock the lights. all it's doing is it's cycling between two lights. And if you look at their tags, you can see this one is set to a 1000 strength multiplier, and this one's set to only 20, which is almost completely off. And what they do is they have this formula effector attached, and then they basically cycle through a wave, a sine wave, and go up and down, and then if you want them faster, you can multiply that. You can replace all of these materials with ones that you want to change out. Absolutely no problem. But I just thought I'd give you a quick intro to the materials. You can see our scene here is looking pretty cool. We've got some foreground stuff. That'll look nice in depth. Just scrub along a bit. You can see all the new data gets pushed to the GPUs. And there we go. There's our disgusting goo coming across the table. Let's go to our last frame just so we're a nice bit closer and see how that's looking. Awesome. So there's our disgustingness spread out. And feel free to change colors and materials out if you like, names. There's some logo stuff in here and labels and things, but you know, have fun with the scene is what I will say. But let's jump into my editor cam so I can kind of fly around a bit. And let's move over to... Now, as you can see, our editor cam has a little bit of bloom on the camera. So if I go to the camera, go to the tag, clearly when I was testing it, I had some bloom settings on, so I'm going to turn those off for a second. Those I will be doing in post, so I'll be doing them when we actually come to compositing, but they are really cool for just testing out in here. I don't really want to bake that into the main render though, so I'll turn them off for now. Let's zoom into our disgusting goo material and just make sure it's looking good. You can see there's a bit of an intersection there with that, but it should blend in quite nicely. Let's just let it resolve a second or two. And you can see it has these gross, like little pockets of air, almost like Swiss cheese, but much, much worse. Yeah, don't eat this. And it's got subsurface scattering, so it kind of takes the light in, scatters it around, and it looks really quite nasty. And obviously this is what's got our disgusting chemicals in it and all that kind of stuff. So somebody definitely shouldn't have let the lid come off of this. So that's looking cool. I'm pretty happy with how that is. And now we have to work out how we're going to do the FUI overlay stuff. So if I just go back to our actual main shot camera, and let's take a look at let's turn the FUI back on. I was going to pause that, but let's just see it when I bring it all back on. Line, there we go. Now, you can see some interestingly weird and fun stuff is happening. So, because these are in a hierarchy, and they don't have any materials assigned to them, they actually take on their parent material and then generate some, default emitter size particles. That is not what we want. I think hopefully you'll agree. So we'll have to create some materials for those and we'll shrink them down. So let's start with some simple stuff. Let's start with the screen, because that's just a simple material, and we actually have a material to switch out quite quickly for that. Oh, we've got it locked still, so let's unlock that. I'll make the icon size a bit larger here just so you can see stuff absolutely clearly. It's a bit less overwhelming in this size panel. So I'm going to turn some of these things off. So I'm actually going to turn the screen edge off, and that's fine for now actually. So the screen geometry here, obviously it has this piece of this material on it, but it's actually a C4D material for the viewport. So we need to just swap that out with the cycles one. And in the viewport, that turns the actual geometry solid. So what we might want to do is we might want to hide it in the viewport, but not in the render, or we can add a display tag, which is probably a nice idea actually. So if I right click, add Cinema 4D tags display, and then attributes, activate use the shading mode, and let's change that to lines, or actually lines is fine, and then isopalms. There we go. So we still get a bit of a grid, but that's fine. Now you can see that is pretty much set up as I wanted it, because obviously I set this up with the rest of the scene, so that's not a problem. So we've done that. Next up, let's actually do that screen edge material. So we need a couple of materials for our particle emitters here. So let's turn this system back on. And we definitely do not want that weirdness. So let's create a new material. And we're going to go for an X-Particles material. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take color over age, because we're actually going to utilize some of that to fade out. So if I create that and I actually drop those onto those two like that. And then you can see this, it's looking very weird because the particle size is huge. Now these are cached, remember. So the particle size is actually baked into the simulation. But what we can do is we can, after the fact, reduce the size by using a cycles. If I go to the cycles tags, instance tags. And what you can do here is you can actually sort of drop the sphere segments down, because cycles is generating geometry for these, because these are going to be so small, you don't need many segments. And then the size multiplier, I can drop it down to say 10%. And you can see immediately they're much, much smaller. And let's go to our editor cam actually, as in our cycles editor camera. Let's just get a nice close up on these. There we go. So we can see now these are still probably a little too large, especially when we pump the brightness on them, because they'll be pin lights, but they'll have like a bloom around them. So we want to kind of find a balance. Just to explain what's going on in this shader here, essentially the age and lifespan are being divided by, age is being divided by lifespan, which normalizes it, and means that even if the particles have a varying lifetime or varying age, they will always start at white, and when they die, they will be a black color. So basically, we want to use that to drive a fade. So in our cycles material, and this is the same for all the render engines, if you can pull in the particle data, you can drive transparency and things like that. So we're going to do it with a mix. So a mix shader here. And let's pull back our emission over to here. And let's drag our mix in between. And then let's grab a transparency or transparent BSDF. And I can't remember the order. I think it's top to bottom. Let's try that. Now, if I disconnect this color ramp completely and I make the emission like a color, just for now, and then I pump this into the mix value here, you can see they're now fading away. See that? How they're kind of fading? The other thing I might want to do is I might want to actually, instead of just mixing the emission over itself, is to actually add it over itself. So we can move this over here. This is our transparency mixing. So basically, let's just get organized. But our emission, I want that to actually be additive, because can you see how it's like it's all the same color? Well, where the particles are dense, I want it to get quite bright. So we need to add them over. We need to add this emission over another transparency. So I can actually duplicate that transparency here and then grab an add shader. Oops, I let go. Drag that in between those two there, and then just add that over there. And now those, can you see how that's now getting this nice hot color? And I really like that. So, and those are being mixed together. So I like to have them on the same column. How you lay out your nodes is entirely a personal preference thing. Everyone will have a different way of doing it, and there might be different reasons to put things in different places. And I even change each, sometimes in the same scene of how I'm doing something just to make it suit. Okay, so we've got our, well, we haven't got our particle color sorted out just yet, but we've got our nice looking color of our, or additiveness to our particles. They're probably still a little too large, like I said, so let's just drop them down in the instance tags. So I'm selecting them both at the same time with Control, and then let's zoom back out. And that's looking pretty cool. I mean, I might have them fade off like later on, so you can do that by just editing this curve, this gradient even, or ramp. And can you see how they get across more, but they'll fade just towards the end of their life. So I'm actually really liking how that's looking. I do want it to be a two-tone color, so I probably will go for the green to blue, and I might do that over age as well. So let's drive this emission color with another ramp. So let's duplicate this ramp. I think duplicating is good just because it's less mouse clicks and movement, so you don't have to go as far, and it's already set up. So there's that ramp here. Now let's create some colors, and we might want to actually create some swatches for this. So let's start with a kind of green, quite a bright green, but if you go to a pure color, you will not be able to get the hot whiting out, because if it's full saturation, it's quite unrealistic. In reality, obviously in the electromagnetic spectrum, there's a spread. There's like a spectrum where a slice is taken out of the electromagnetic spectrum, and it includes more than just the single color. And if you're pure one color and zero of another, it's very unrealistic in terms of how we perceive color. So you want to drop it below 100% saturation, and in fact you want to kind of perhaps be down at sort of 70ish, 60. We'll see. So let's add this to a swatch. This is going to be called FUI colors. And there we go. Let's duplicate that one because we want to be in the same kind of tonal range. Jump to our HSV. If you want to show these color palette things at the same time, you just hold Shift and you can add them to the things that are being displayed. And we can just shift around here. Nice blue color. Probably want more of an an electronic blue. That's quite an interesting look. I quite like that. But let's change this knot down here to... Oh, I didn't save that blue. Let's expand this color here. And I'm going to delete that one there. Yeah. If you want to quickly create a gradient of two colors or any set of colors, in fact, if I drag this one, you see that we create a gradient out of all these. This is a really handy thing if you're creating loads of gradients around, and we will be. Trust me, there's a few more of these that we'll do. So that's looking pretty cool. I might reduce the particle size on the mist particles, or the spray ones. I might drop them down really low. That's too low. Now remember, also let this resolve a little bit, because sometimes you won't get a feeling for how the particles are looking until they've rendered a few seconds. Because of the noise, obviously they're really small, fine details, and to have a pixel resolve in a path tracer, you need to give it a second or two. But that's looking pretty cool. We might come back and tweak those colors, but I'm pretty happy with how that's looking right now. Let's just let's have a look at it in camera. Maybe we'll make some changes then. No, I think I'm liking that. It's looking pretty cool. When we render it full res, that's when it'll really show. So what you can actually do is you can turn on the render region in the cycles window here, and you can reduce down the render region to like one of these corners, and then you can go render, and we're currently fitting everything to the viewport, so I'm not going to limit the render size, and I'm also going to turn fit off. And what that means is it'll restart, and we'll get like a... Yep, there we go. And you get a bit more refinement a bit quicker. So actually I will tweak some settings. I'm going to reduce this size down a little more, maybe to 3. I'm going to actually increase the emission value just to kind of give it a bit more. If I go too high, look, you'll see it'll create like it'll all become kind of a one homogeneous color. There you go. So I'm going to drop it down to 3. That's pretty cool. And I am going to wash these colors out a touch more because they're a bit too primary for me at the moment. So let's try... Let's push that bit more into the blue, perhaps. Oh no, actually, I'm kind of happy with that. I quite like the tone it's got. Yeah, about there. But I am going to drop the saturation, as I said before. That's how you kind of get the washing out. And then same with this one. So maybe make that a bit more green as well. The saturation on the blue can be a bit more just to kind of balance out there. And can you see how that's now going white like it would do like in when you add light to itself or emissive items to themselves, they do that. Okay, that's pretty cool. I could put the camera effects on as well, the post effects on, but we'll do that later when we've got a dark background for it to show up on. So let's go back to our limited and fitting viewports and turn the render region off and give it a sec to just resend that data. There we go. Cool. So that's looking really nice. Now, the next thing I want to do, like I said, is these lines need to be rendered. So let's work out what we're going to do for those. So I'm pretty happy with that one. Screen edge is good. Screen geometry is good. Let's go up to the top and take a look at our particle labels section. So we are going to need to add some cycles tags to these to make sure that they render. So if I right click them all, remember it's the most splines, not the traces. Add a curve to them. And you can see we've actually been given, well, it selects the tag after that so that we can actually change that to an equal size. That's going to be way too dense. In fact, it's actually rendering those in the scene right now. So, in fact, I could probably... Let's actually hide the background scene for now. So let's hide all that. Let's hide our sample surface. The goo can stay on for a second. And we can even hide the robotic arm as well. So just expand that out and get that. I will actually leave the geo on because then we can see... Oh, okay. Well, that's fine. The screen is on the robotic arm layer, so I'm not gonna mess with that. So okay, we've got our tags on here. We now need to add a material. So let's in fact, actually, this setup in here is actually very similar to what we would need for the trails. So we can actually adapt it by duplicating this. So I'm going to actually duplicate that, and let's rename it. I like to put a Sci for cycles at the front, and we'll say labels or label lines. There we go. Cool. And instead of our input being this particle info and all these math divides and everything, and we don't need transparency, so we don't need the last set of transparency, and we can shape to disconnect those. And then if I select those two and hit C, it'll connect them up. What it does is it looks for the first available port. So if there's another one, if I press C again, or if I have another there, it'll actually add it to the second port down. So that's just, it's very, I love it. I love having shortcuts like that, but it's good to know a couple of quirks. So, okay, we don't need this, we don't need this, and we don't need this. What we do want is in fact, let me just apply that to in fact, because I've got these objects selected, I can just right click this material and I can hit apply, and it'll apply it to each of those in turn. Excellent. So I think the radius is clearly way too big on those, so we're gonna have to tweak that. It's probably more like a tenth of that. So let's do 0.1 and 0.1, and that's much better. It's not as offensive. We also, by the way, we need to apply this material, or at least a similar material, to our circles, but we'll do that in a minute. First up, I actually want to have a gradient coming down from the 0.2, I think it was, down to each particle. So what we need to do is there's a little trick where we can use a hair info node. There it is. And what this does is actually, if you hit intercept, it actually creates from top to bottom or bottom to top a UV essentially. It's like a value from the it's not a UV, obviously. It's not in 2D space. It's actually in a 1D space. So basically, yeah, the bottom here is like 1, and at the top is 0. And then what you can do, obviously, with that is you can remap that with the gradient. And so there you go. You can see we get our green at the start here down to our blue. And I think that's the order we'll have it doing that in. But you will notice that it's done it on the one at the top here. And I don't want it to go green, or I don't want it to go blue in that section. I actually just want it to, let me go into the editor cam again, the cycles editor cam. Let's zoom into that section. Can you see how it's got that gradient down it now at the moment? I don't want that. I want it to actually not sort of have a solid color, and it's going to be that green color. Let's save those, by the way. Oops. Grabbing the wrong part. These are the edited colors, and those are the old ones that I don't want anymore. Perfect. So that gradient goes to blue, but we're going to have to create another material to make sure that just stays like a solid color. So what I'll do is I'll duplicate that material again. We'll call this label lines and then a suffix of solid. And then I'm going to add that to that first Mo spline, the one up there. So let's add that to that one. And I'm also going to add that to our circles, because those are also going to be just a solid color, and I'm going to make them the blue. So as ever, have at it with design and stuff. This is all just what I prefer to do. So let's drag these. We can copy the exact same, because we want the same thickness, with the curve tag. And those are now rendering in our scene. But it's still got this gradient, and you can see they're even got the gradient on there. If I drop the emission down, by the way, to 1, you can see the color a bit more clearly. But we still want it to be kind of hot in the camera, as if the camera's overexposed a bit, just to get that nice blooming and stuff. But that's not what we want, the gradient, so we're going to drop the gradient out. So let's think of a way to do this. So I want 2 different colors but on one material applied to separate objects. So what we can do is we can actually pull in the object color and use that to drive our emission color. So if that doesn't make sense, let's play around with that now. So I've just got a flat color here in the emission, and I can change that to whatever I want. You know, I could change it to a pink here, and it'll just force that to pink. I could create another material and assign it, but if I need to then edit those 2 materials, I have to do the change in both of the materials. Whereas it's much more preferable to be able to just deal with one material, or as few materials as possible. So I'm going to add another info node here. In fact, I can just do it with an attribute. So if I go attribute, grab the attribute node, and I'm going to change it from its mode to object color. Then I'm going to connect that up to the emission. And now if I go to our objects themselves, and you can see they're currently this blue color. If I go to basic, that is actually probably their layer color. Oh no, it's their actual color. So we set a color earlier on, obviously, in the training. And if I change that to like a pink or a purple, there we go. We get the purple. But we know which color we want. We want the blue for this one. And I should turn the emission back up to 2 just so it matches. There we go. And then the topmost line, this one, change this one to that green color. Excellent. So now when I zoom back out, and notice when you're close in, the color is actually getting hotter and hotter, but when you're further out, it's actually a bit more toned down, and you get more of the realistic look. So this is all starting to come together quite nicely, and we're definitely seeing something that's starting to look like a futuristic user interface type deal. And there's only a few more bits to do, and we're going to use very similar strategies that we've done here. But let's we're in our editor cam. That's cool. Just to give you kind of an idea, there's all sorts of cool stuff. FUI looks brilliant with a bit of depth of field, so always recommend adding some of that. In fact, we will definitely have some. So let me just line my camera up a bit. And if you jump to the camera itself, let me close that. Go down to our cameras. We can see this is set by, I've actually got this set up so that these nulls here are the focal points, but I need to go into the camera settings, and you can see in depth of field, you've either got an f-stop or a radius. We'll use radius to start, and that's a bit extreme actually. That's still extreme, but let's, do you know how the color becomes more primary when you do that as well? So that's another reason to. Now if I bring that forward, if I put the snapping on, actually, that'll enable snapping, polygon snapping. I think it might be snapping to stuff that's not even in my, there we go. Yeah, it's actually snapping to stuff that's hidden, so I should just snap it down to somewhere over here. Oh, interesting. I feel like it's snapping to something that's not even showing. There we go. Can you see how nice that looks with a bit of depth of field? And if we looked up like along here, you get that beautiful detail, but then blooming out to these kind of mid-sized details. So you get this beautiful balance between fine and larger details. Cool. So that's just can't help myself sometimes to play around. But let's turn the depth of field off that camera for a second. Let's throw the post effects back on just so you can see. You can see now it's starting to feel like a realistic within this scenario screen. So that's cool. So I'll turn the bloom back off just for practicality reasons. And let's go into here. And this is the last part where we're going to actually create the look for these particles, or actually not particles, they're actually the display render items here. Very similar to what we've done with all the other spline stuff. So it's actually in this FUI normals interface here. Actually, we should just call this the goo FUI, shouldn't we? Goo FUI, there we go. And now let's just duplicate our tags, because we can just grab. There we go, duplicate those. Straight away, we get our items rendered or displayed exactly as we want them, or not quite exactly as we want them, in our render. So that's pretty cool. But the problem is that it's got a specific color, and to be able to remap that's not going to be. I want it to go from the green to the blue again, because that's our scheme color for this scanner. We could leave it this other color, but I want to make it unified. So to do that, we're going to have to change the render, the color that they are right now, because there's no data that we can access to remap. What I want to do is go into the FUI normals, and if we go to our display tab, remember this gradient is what's being displayed in the lines here. So if I load a preset, change it, something a bit more weird, you see that's now changed that one there. I could do that with this, all sorts. Excellent, but not what we want. Let's load a preset. Let's do the black to white, the default black to white transparent, and do just a straight up black to white gradient. Now it's taking a little second there, because remember, we're generating the lines at the same time. So I'm going to do a linear on both those knots. And then I'm going to just right click on there, copy that color, go into this one, go to display, right click and paste. And we get the same for the ones on the ground. I'm not sure if we're going to keep those ones, to be honest. They're a bit weird. I think I'll leave them. We'll see. But now I've got this black and white value from the closer or the longer ones to the shorter ones. I can now remap that. So what we'll do is we'll take because it's object color, we're going to have to create another another material for this one, because this is a unique one as well. So label lines, solid, it's going to be called goo FUI, I guess. And let's replace those two materials. And we're still using that color attribute, but this time we're going to ramp them. And we could, instead of loading a preset, if we just select this knot here, show our colors, drag that onto there, and we'll get our blue to, or hopefully our blue to green. Yeah, there we go. So that's now sort of more on theme. And when we zoom out, we'll get the more, there we go. Getting those colors nicely done there. So let's do a couple of final checks on our shot here. Let's just flick between a few frames, and you can see as it evolves, it's going to change. You see that? So that's why I quite like that. It adapts, and we're going to be wiping our FUI on around about this point here. So this is perfect. Cool. See the lines pop out, and we get the circles highlighting the other parts. Now I'm just going to do probably one last pass, just check some thicknesses on these. These lines might be a bit too thick, perhaps. Maybe we want to go a bit finer on those. So I'm just going to go into my editor cam. And I don't know if it's the thickness, actually. Maybe it's the color. I'm not liking the ones on the bottom here. So let's try reducing those thickness down relative to the other one. Let's just divide by 2, make them a bit more subtle, perhaps. Yeah, I think I quite like that. Just so it's not as sort of obvious as these other ones. And also, I'm not getting enough of the blue in here, so we might tweak the gradient. Or what we could do, actually, we could use the hair attribute trick. In fact, we could probably just use the cable lines material for these. Let's try that. Yeah, do you know what? I think I prefer that. So let's zoom in. So can you see now how each of these now has a color from top to bottom? Yeah, I think I like that. And that also makes them a consistent, so each one of them is a consistent color to color gradient. And I might leave the ones on the floor with that kind of look there. So awesome. Okay, so I think we're pretty much ready to set the scene up for a render, but we need to work out, like I said before, how are we going to render this and be able to isolate the layers and manipulate them in post instead of having to get it perfect in the render. What if our FUI doesn't look very good? Well, obviously we can just render with everything else turned off or as matte black, but that's going to be a bit complicated because, well, it's not complicated, it's more that we lose something. And if I put our layers back on, make sure everything's rendering again, and our sample surface and everything, takes a second to load in, of course, because I've just added loads. Well, not that long. There we go. Now, one of the main things we would lose, and it's probably not easy to see just yet, but we get these nice reflections of the actual UI. And I wanted to have that in there because it kind of feels like it's connected to the scene in a kind of a three-dimensional way that might, future augmented realities might be able to do. But we definitely would lose reflections off the edges of this screen and things like that. So I'm probably gonna tweak it so that the scene, we're gonna render 2 versions of this scene. And so let's turn off our FUI and turn that off here. And let's leave it in the scene. And this will be our base render. Now that's hidden our goo actually, so that's no good. We're gonna have to pull that goo out of its. Because it's a child, unfortunately, that it translates that. So system goo generates another object. Now we can just pull this out of here. And now that's going to be treated separately from the other one. So that's just a bit of a limitation, but not a problem. There we go. So that's our goo mesh. If I scrub around, you'll see it renders nicely in the scene. And this will be our base render. This is something to just render as is, and I'm going to be pretty happy with that. Perhaps with an ID or two. I don't think I want too many IDs, but perhaps if we made an ID of the goo and the agar, we can isolate that. So that and that. We could use a cryptomat, but I think that'd be overkill for this scene. I only really want one ID here, and it's this one. So I've got these 2 objects selected. Let's right-click them. Actually, I'll tell you what, I could use a material ID. So if I go to my render settings, go to my render elements, I could actually use a material ID because I've just realized that this is the only material I'm actually interested in. So I select the material. This is something I don't do often because I often have way too many materials in the scene that are slight variants, but when obviously, yeah, certain impracticalities. So we've got this material ID here, and I'm just going to make it different. So I'm going to make it 123, or you could make it 500, as long as it's not 1. 1 is the default. So all of these materials have a material ID of 1. Can you see that? So as I click on them, oh, not that one. There we go. So if I did that one, all my materials would be the same, and it would be pointless. So that's fine. We're going to just use that ID off the agar. I'm calling it agar, but call it whatever you want. 500, and then I go into here, and that'll automatically be generated when we render. I also want the Emissive stuff, that's fine. In fact, I probably want a reasonable number of these layers just in case I want to use them. Now, we might not actually use them to composite with, but I think it's always good to have a strategy when you're doing your test renders to try these out. If you find that you're not using them in compositing, just leave them out for space saving. So I don't think we'll need diffuse at all. I tend to like having a glossy pass. Subsurface color, I think we can leave that out. And then everything else, I think, maybe shadows. Shadows is a good one to just boost the kind of contrast in your scene. Everything else, I think I'll leave out. That's not a problem. And maybe use a Z depth as well. The Z depth would be good for creating kind of a, well, there's Z depth in a mist pass, but some depth to the scene. But I for this particular one, because we've already got depth of field, we're going to build that in. I don't think we're going to use it. So we'll leave that as is. Everything else is fine. Yeah, and we've got these sort of preset settings from the other file. So you can stick with these, tweak them depending on your system, of course. So everyone's system is different, and it's worth checking out what the best tile sizes are, whether to use CPU, GPU, whether to use all devices or not, that kind of thing, or use your CPU at the same time, all sorts of stuff. But anyway, for our purposes, we don't need to worry about that. And I'm just showing you how I will set that up. I won't show you the rendering itself, only until we get to the end. I'm actually going to do all frames. And then, is there anything else we need to tweak for this before we set it up? No, I think, so that's pretty good. The depth of field, I don't think that's actually set up. So let's do that now. I'm just going to pause that render, and then we could do a focus pull. So like we've got a focus currently down on the deck here. I want another focus up close on this screen here. So what I'll do is I'll duplicate that, and I'll call this focus blend or morph. And then this one, we'll call this focus close. And then I'm going to transfer that to the screen. So you remember we've got that screen geometry. Did I put that in the FUI? I must have done. Make sure everything's generating. There we go. Yep. So I'm gonna do a transfer command. So I could either make it a child of the screen and zero it, or if I bring up my commander, transfer command, model command, and then either I can kind of pick it in the window here, and that should have moved it to the center. Oh, have I lost my? There we go. And that's actually the center of our screen. So that's exactly where I want the focus point. I want the screen to be pin sharp at this point. So let's now create a pose morph. So pose morph, and I'm going to change it for a position pose morph. Now I don't need the base pose, to be honest. Sorry, the pose 0. I want the pose 0 to be the target. So I'm going to hit the target there. And can you see, now let me make this really obvious. That's very obvious, there we go. Can you see that? Let me put this into layer mode, actually. If I put the viewport into layer mode, we'll be able to read it a bit better. There we go. Or somewhat better. Let's hide our FUI. And now let's blend. So in the PSR, pose morph tag, go to animate, and now if you see, we can slide. Now we've just created a rack focus. Now it's just to decide where to do that. So let's choose a frame that's going to be suitable. Something like where we landed, because I don't want it to rack focus when we've got the interesting looking goo down here. So maybe kind of after it's settled, which was about 150, I think, the goo kind of slows down. And then let's try add a keyframe there. And then about a second later, or 20 frames later, maybe. I want it to be quite quick. I don't want it to be sort of like a slow focus pull. So I'm just going to go 180. So it's half a second. Just make sure it's moving. Obviously, we won't be able to tell completely until I start rendering it. So let's do that. Okay, so that's actually kind of halfway across. Oh, we haven't got any If I go to the camera, we haven't actually got any depth settings at the moment. I'm just going to go into my main shot and just double check. Yeah. So this is already set up in the scene. If you've got your own camera, you just need to make sure that this focus morph is in the focus object section. And I want to activate or increase the aperture size. So 0.01 is just ludicrous. It's just to kind of get a slight feel for the depth of field. We'll drop it. We're probably going to go down to something as subtle as 0.01 maybe. Give it a second to resolve and then decide if that's... I think we can go a little bit higher. Let's go 0.02. Yeah, that's looking pretty cool. Now that's halfway through its transition to full focus on the front here, so I'm just going to move it along. Let's hide the rest of the scene. Just because the FUI is the stuff we want pin sharp, it's going to be easier to see when we turn that other stuff off. Yeah, that's looking cool. So nice and sharp there. The goo analysis is out of focus. And I quite like the idea of having, the same depth as the scene. And the benefit of all this being 3D is that we can do that. So let's go back to that 160th or 165th frame. And there we go, pin sharp on the background, but this is slightly thrown out. So that's awesome. I'm pretty happy with how that's looking. And I think now is the time to talk about the strategy for getting the reflections and stuff. So that's the focus pull done. Now, what are we going to do? So I've got back to where we were with the FUI being a separate layer. And we're going to render this as the base layer. So lock all this up, deactivate it all. And we render this as a completely separate scene. And it's going to be our base beauty render. Now we can use takes for this. So this is something that's quite useful. If I turn on our FUI again, and I go to the takes tab, this is I can't remember what version this was added in. You don't have to use these. It might look a bit intimidating to start with, but I use them extensively in pretty much every project I do because it means that it saves on having multiple files. You can have multiple setups, and this scenario that we're doing here is exactly the scenario I would use it for. So I'm going to create a child take, and what that does is it takes everything from the main take, which is just your scene as is, and it'll just inherit everything from that main scene until we modify or override something. So the new take, let's rename it as beauty, and that's going to be our beauty base render. And what we can do is to make sure that this renders the correct items and elements in this scene. Oh, sorry, at this moment, we can activate this thing here, which is auto take, and that just means that now in my scene, it's a bit like auto keyframe. Anything I touch or edit any parameter in the scene, an override will automatically be added for it. So I will caution that when that mode is active, as soon as you change anything, even like the window position of the node editor, you'll save it to this take. It's not a problem. It's just be aware that it's a bit of a gotcha if you're not aware of it. Okay, so we've got the beauty. Now I know I want to turn off the FUI layer, so I'm going to turn that off. I can leave the layer showing. And you see I'm changing all of these toggles. And now if you can see here on our takes, it's actually called the override window or the override tree. And you can see here, these are all the overrides I've just added. So visible in editor, false. Visible in render view, false. Manages, it's true. Animation, false. Generators, false. So basically it's just telling me that I've deactivated it, I've locked it, and everything else is turned off. So that's great. Now, I'm going to create a child of that take. Now, I could create just another take below, but the benefit of this is that if I change the camera or anything in the beauty take, it propagates down into the FUI take. So let's do a new child take. Do FUI. Let's go back up to our... just stay in our layer browser, actually. And this is where we can use the layers very powerfully, of course. So I don't want anything other than the FUI. But there's a little caveat here. I don't want to hide stuff because I still wanted to intersect and have the reflections and stuff. So I'm going to introduce you to something that is already in the scene all along, but I haven't explained what it is just yet. So let's do the main thing, which is actually to make sure that the FUI is turned on. Now, obviously, it was already turned on in the main take, so we're adding an extra override to turn it back on here. But that always means that no matter where that FUI take is in the hierarchy, it will always turn on the FUI layer. So that's cool. And let's go to our objects again. Oh, sorry. Let's first of all, always be careful. Turn off the take overrides and the lock overrides as well. So that just means that we can interact with our scene normally again, and just avoid adding too many takes and stuff. So go back to your object tab, and in the scene, just look for this item. And if you've created your own materials or using a different engine, you might have to go about this a different way, using material overrides, that kind of thing. But this is how I've set it up in here. So go down to scene, and you'll see this weird named null with all the materials sat on it. The reason I got the materials sat on it is that I could transfer them to different scenes and save them out separately, but that's fine. So if I click on it, and then I go to the attributes window, you'll see this has this user data, and it says matte on and off. Now, what is that? So if I look at the end of this, there's actually an espresso tag. If I jump into the espresso tag, you can see here, there's a bunch of stuff I've already set up for us. So in every material for the base scene, at least, I've created something that will be driven by this on and off switch. So you can think of on and off as 0 or 1. And you can see it's going into these FACs, which means it's a factor, so like a slider. So a 0 to 1 slider or whatever slider it is. You can think of it as a percentage as well. So I've got them going into all our materials here. If I click them, you can see they're just, if I double click that one, you see it's connected. But it's not immediately obvious which factor it is, because there are multiple in, you see there's one there, and there's one here. And the one it's this one here. So in every material, I have added a mix, sort of BSDF, and I've created a kind of a rig that means that basically when I hit the Boolean button on the matte fake, it's going to blend, instead of using the material that's in the scene right now, it's going to blend it into this, whatever I've replaced it with. And they're kind of a mix between diffuse, just black diffuse, zero emission shaders. So if I go into the Agar one, most of them are just principled nodes. So they're the similar nodes, but they're just black with some reflection. It didn't need to be advanced. Like, we didn't need to get the like noisy reflections and stuff. This is just purely for a compositing layer, remember? So anyway, don't worry about all that. I'm just explaining it to you if you're interested. The real key thing is that when we're on this take for FUI, put our take overrides back on. And if I actually unselect that, you can see it's got this light blue color until I click it, and then it turns to white, which means it's overridden. And if I go to objects, you can see this matte fake control is on. And all of a sudden, all of our materials in our scene have gone black. Let's change our camera to the editor camera. Zoom out. Can you see that? Like, everything is now a black but shiny, like a reflective surface. Now, the red is coming from the lights in the scene, and we do not want any extra lights in the scene. Otherwise, what would happen is we're essentially adding 2 layers of gloss to our scene when we go and composite it in After Effects or whatever we're compositing in. So what we want to do is we want to actually also deactivate go to the layers, and we want to turn off the lights. So let's do that now. Let's turn off the lights in the render. We can lock them as well. That's always just a safe protection thing. And there you go. We're starting to see some really interesting stuff here. Now, there is something that I haven't really considered, and that's the fact that when we render this, the goo is on. I think I'm going to want it to render with the goo turned off. And I'll show you why. So, because I actually want to perhaps see some of those interior particles, and we might need to create another material for that. So let's just jump back to our main scene. And let's actually deactivate, or should we deactivate? I think... yeah, well, let's not deactivate, because otherwise it will lose the reaction. Let's hide that OpenVDB mesh. And remember, our take overrides is active, so you can look here, And notice, by the way, as I've moved the editor camera around, it's also added the take override. So as always, be careful with that stuff. So I'll just delete that from there. But you can see here our OVDB mesh is now overridden and it's off in the render. Let's turn the take overrides off. And I just want to take a look at the actual particles in here. And let's pause that render actually. Let's go to my main layout just to have a look. Let's go to my editor, my default camera actually. I think it'd be great to render these particles, not all of them because that's going to just look too dense. Let's jump into our editor cam actually. Zoom into this and let's just render that. Let's see what that looks like when we render it. So we could just grab the X-Particles color here. So we could just use the same color as this one. Throw it onto there. Let's just hit play and see how that looks. It's going to be way too dense, is my suspicion. Yes. So firstly, the particle sizes look too large. So let's just right click, cycles tag, cycles instance. Remember, drop the sphere segments, not essential, but kind of helps. And then let's drop the particle size. Now that looks pretty interesting. Problem is that even this far back, that's going to look like just a hazy kind of volumetric thing. And that looks pretty cool in itself. You know, maybe we want to go with that. But for me, I think I just want it to be a few of the particles. I don't want it to be all of the particles. So let's go back to our main cam, just so that we're dealing with in-shot edits. I've just noticed snapping still on, so let's turn that off. Yeah, that's looking pretty cool, but yeah, too dense. So let's jump into that material. In fact, let's duplicate that material. And let's call this Sci Goo Particles. You can name these whatever you like. So I'm going to drag that onto the Goo Particles emitter. And we're going to get exactly the same look because that's the same thing. I think we could make those well, actually, let's just deal with this first. So I don't really want to give them color by age anymore because that's kind of a bit arbitrary for this scenario. The transparency thing, we're going to use that to actually cull our particles. So what do I mean by that? I'm actually going to take a random sample of our particles. Do you know what? I will jump back into our editor cam so we're close up. There we go. Or I could have done a render region and zoomed in, but that's fine. For now, I'm just going to deal with the basics. And so I don't want it to color by age. You can see that we get this. If I change this, let's just change this to a full spectrum color. Let's load one of the, oops, I'm loading those instead of gradients. Load preset, candy. And you can see you do get this kind of redness to start with, but it's a bit sort of mushed out and weird. Like it's not very interesting. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to randomize everything. So let's, if I actually, because we're bringing in the particle info, we can actually bring in that color, but that color's kind of it's not the color we want. It's got some of the greenness to it, but we could even use it. If we grab it, we can actually remap it, but you got to remember, these are not black and white values, so they're not going to be particularly easy to remap. So if I select the color ramp, let's go back to our nice blue to green color ramp. Drag those onto there. Now that's not too bad, but we're going to have to crunch it to get it to respond properly. Can you see how it's not particularly easy to tweak? I mean, that's actually quite interesting. I quite like the green on the bottom there and the blue on the outside. So let's leave it as that for the color. But now we need to change totally how the transparency is applied. Because at the moment, remember, it's getting more transparent over age, and we don't want that. So let's shake this node out. You can just shake them out, and then you can disconnect this one by just Alt dragging across there. And I want to actually utilize this random particle option. And what it does is it assigns a value to each of these particles randomly. And if I connect that up to this color ramp here, which is just a black and white ramp, and it feeds into our transparency. Now, at the moment, it's mostly white, so most of it is a solid opacity, essentially. If I switch it over, it's actually going to kill or cull a lot of the particles. Can you see how that's a lot more sparse? And because it's random, it's done evenly over the whole set of particles. So I really like this technique for after it's cached, after you've simulated, being able to isolate just a few particles. So let's really go down to like a really small number of particles by just crunching this. That's nice. And we can play with the size here. So let's just bump it 3 times the size or something like that. And there we go. We get a more coarse representation of our simulation, but we've done it utilizing the existing sim. So not only have we got these attached kind of, we've really got some mileage out of this one emitter even after it was cached. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with how that's looking. So that's pretty cool. And maybe the emission value is too high. When we jump back in, I mean, we might need to pump it even brighter than that, but let's have a look. So jump back to our main shot camera. And yeah, so now we're getting way more of the form of the goo, but also it's not like it's not too dense so that it'll just flood the image with the FUI. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. Might even go lower on the density there. I mean, it could be that you just have it really, really tight, like 95. So we're currently, 91, 95. Crunch it and maybe pump the brightness a bit. It's all about tweaking and letting it resolve a little bit. Yeah, I really like that. Okay, awesome. So, okay, now we've got all of that in our scene. I think we can hide a few more bits from our FUI because we've actually, using that matte fake that I've done, which literally switches the colors of the materials to a black material. I can see there's some stuff reflecting back here. We don't need that. I don't think that's too far away for it to be reasonable. So I can just hide those bits, and let's go to our takes. Make sure we're on take override, and lock overrides is on and auto take is active. We can probably hide the ceiling. That's not even visible at the moment. So hide the ceiling, hide the desk in the back there. Actually, do we want the desk? No, that's fine. I think these are the primary elements that we want to be able to see. So if I hide them in the viewport as well, it just gives us a better idea of what we're doing here. Excellent. So that's do we even need the test tubes? No. Actually no, the test tubes are a bit closer to, so they actually catch. Can you see? They actually catch a bit of the light. So I'm going to leave that as is. Turn off our take overrides, our lock overrides and auto takes. In fact, you can leave lock overrides on. That's probably a safer option, but it's fine. That is now ready to render. So you can see here we've got cameras set up. We can just set inherit from parent, and on the beauty, set this up for main shot, main camera. There we go. Now when I jump back to this other take, beauty take, hopefully, if we've done this correctly, our materials will be restored to their normal state. They are. And the lights have been turned back on, and all of the FUI stuff has been turned off. Excellent. Now, the one last piece of this puzzle is actually the render settings themselves. So we've already dealt with I told you about the integrator and the sampling and stuff. That's up to you to set that as high as you like. Depending on your performance of your machine, you might want to reduce the ray bounces, that kind of stuff, if you want a speedier sim. All sorts. You could do some denoising, things like that. But for me, all I need to worry about is the how I'm going to render the FUI separately or differently from this one. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make this a child render setting, and I'm going to call this one FUI. And then you can either assign these here, so I could right click here, or sorry, not right click, just click these render setting icons, and you can hit cycles there, and then cycles FUI for that one. And the reason I've got two separate render settings is maybe I don't want to render as long on one shot, and maybe the element had dissolved off. In our case, it doesn't, but maybe you're having different time sequences. So let me jump into the FUI one. And really all I wanted to do with this is actually deactivate some of the multipass layers that we don't need. So render elements, I don't need, actually I do need glossy direct. I don't need shadow. I don't need the material IDs. And then that's it. those are the two differences. It just saves on wasting the space. And there you go, it's loaded up nicely. Okay, so this is looking very promising, and I think we are actually ready to render now. So I've set it up as a 1080p render. Up it if you like, if you're brave. File sizes always increase magnitudes when you do that, but that's fine. There's no render region active. That's cool. And yeah, and then you just set your save settings. I've got some sort of token stuff there. You can change that to whatever you like, to your local machine. And then I need to activate multipass. So on both of these, I'm going to activate multipass, right click it, and add. You have to add the post effects option to make sure that cycles render elements show. So now, because I've done that on the top one, it has also done that in the one below. So I don't need to do all of this stuff twice. So you can see the benefit there. So you just give this a name and change this file type. Actually, let's get it PNGs. Let's talk about the file name actually, because that's something important. So I'm just going to clear that out. And what I tend to do is I tend to have a local folder that's somewhere related to the folder I always keep my C4D files. So I tend to have the same tokens in this, or relative path in this save window here. So I'm going to show you one that is like a default one I like to use. And it'll put it in the same folder that your files are saved in. So you could do // and then just renders. And then another // and then you could do the date maybe if you like, but then that means if you render the next day, continuing a render, it might be in the wrong place, but that's fine. But what we do want is we want to say, first of all, maybe the file, the project it's being rendered from, you can actually do $PRJ, and you can access all these, by the way, by, you see this arrow drop down here? You can see we've got these. So you've got the project, which is my document, and it'll add the $PRJ token for you. And then the other one that's important is actually the take. So I'm probably less inclined to add the project, but more inclined to add the take. But let's do both. So let's do / now, and then $take, another /, and then I'm going to do let's give it a name. So this is actually what's going to be written on the file. So we could say X-Particles Premium Training, XPPT, Particle Effects, and then this one's 05. Sci-Fi, and then an underscore, and then followed by this $take, which is going to add it's going to either say beauty or FUI at the after. And then if we add that, copy that, paste that into the second one here, and then on this one I tend to add like an MP for multipass. You can add whatever you like to those, that's not a problem. And then cycles will actually add suffixes based on its layer names anyway, so that's fine. So let's double check. Now go down to you can see in our FUI one, that's also given it the same. So you can see here, I could write something else in here. So if I just put some random numbers in here, this is now overridden. So if I right click this and I go inherit parent, you see it defaults back to whatever the one here was. So excellent. Right. Well, now that's the last thing we wanted to do before rendering. Just double check things. Let's just jump from, let's just make sure the assignment's good. So that's cycles, that's FUI. The frame ranges, let's just double check those. Excellent, 300 and 300, and we're doing the 1080p. Okay, so I think that's it. We're going to render, and I'll meet you back in the compositing section, and happy rendering.